The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read-along podcast. I am Tylor, that is Greg, and as far as I'm concerned, that's all of the intro you need. Greg, is there anything else to add?
I just want to throw in the off-topic fact that we have a parent in Star Wars now since we last met, I think, or since we last recorded. They canonically revealed that Mon Mothma's husband is named Perrin. And I texted you to say, hey, did you see this week's Andor? And you responded knowing immediately that that is what I wanted to talk about. And said, yes, I saw there was a parent. It's weird.
And as far as I'm concerned, a parent in Star Wars is as good of a transition as we are going to get between our day-to-day lives and the introduction to this chapter. So why don't we just dive straight in? One quick thing I do want to throw in, we do not have an ill-advised discussion of visual media this week, despite the fact that we did have a new chapter icon. So chapter 35, Caemlyn, does include a new chapter icon, the Lion of Andor. I want to wait. I think it'll be 2 or 3 weeks until we meet the characters that this stands in for, in addition to the kingdom that it stands in for. Always like to give updates for people who probably get not at all excited about the visual updates, but this is how we're going to go about it. But why don't we begin by diving in then to chapter 34, The Last Village. And this chapter picks up with Rand basically being baffled by how much has happened to him in the last 3 days. And yeah, a lot has happened to him in the last 3 days. Rand and Mat are exhausted. They're worn out. They have been lightninged and attacked and all sorts of different things. Eventually, they manage to fall asleep in a haystack. Literally, that's the best they can do after fleeing from a woman who was trying to murder them. And when they awake, they find that the Caemlyn Road is not all of a sudden, but seemingly even more than before, crowded with a large number of individuals who are making their way to Caemlyn in an attempt to see the false dragon, right? He's been captured, we now know, and is apparently being brought through Caemlyn, where a large number of people are interested in seeing him pass. We also learn that Caemlyn is kind of bursting with people who are trying to get in to see this, and the guards are actually more worried about more people getting in the city than they are any havoc that's being caused. We eventually see Mat and Rand make their way to the titular Last Village. While there, they kind of seemingly come upon a street light that lights a bunch of other people, but not them. So they are somehow unnoticed. And they briefly witness an interaction between the innkeeper in the village and what appears to be a Fade who is giving it some sort of instructions. And then they also hear an interaction between the innkeeper and a farmer who seems pretty skeptical of this sketchy person who wouldn't show his face in town. Very quickly, Mat and Rand realize they cannot stay in town because the innkeeper is working for a Fade. So they try to catch a ride with the person who hates the innkeeper, and it works. They manage to get a ride. Mr. Bunt, I believe the individual's name is. And then Mr. Bunt proceeds to give us a solid 2 or 3 pages of exposition that I'm sure we're going to break down in more detail as we go. A little bit about the history of Andor and a few other things. And then finally, we get yet another of Rand's patented dreams. This one fairly brief, but interestingly featuring more or less every one of the characters in some way being creepy or dying. So that's exciting. And then at the end of the chapter, we find, actually, this might be the beginning of the next chapter, we find that we have arrived in Caemlyn. Either way, this chapter ends. And Greg, what did you think about this chapter? And I'm going to kind of keep you constrained to the first half because I actually want to talk about the first paragraph, but I'll let you get your first thoughts before we do.
I mean, I think I am feeling fatigue of this storyline, and I would maybe give Robert Jordan saying like, yeah, it's supposed to, because the characters are fatigued and they're like worn out and they're sick of all this and suffering. And so I think there's a way in which you naturally empathize with that. But also just we've been with these characters a long time. I was shocked to see that these two chapters, and I believe on from here again, we have even more. So kind of shocking to me that we established this pattern of jumping between, and then it's like almost a whole book's worth, like a normal sized person's book, like
Yeah,
a
an
hundred
actual book.
yeah 100 200 pages or so. So I think I'm feeling that fatigue, but I wouldn't say that that's just like I think that's what Robert Jordan wants you to feel to some degree. And so I think other than that, maybe just that I could tell those paragraphs of backstory were important, but maybe the fatigue was overwhelming me, and I found myself kind of skimming some of them. I'm like, yeah. I'll wait till you explain this later. So, yeah, so not my favorite chapter, I guess, is where I'm at.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, I feel kind of the same way. When I look back on The Eye of the World every time that I'm considering another reread, and I'm like, well, I gotta read The Eye of the World as the first part of that, I always kind of think of it as like there's the setup section, and then there's the big old slog of the middle, and then it's great. And I find this is the part for me where that big old slog of the middle feels a little bit like a slog, right? This is, I think it's like chapter 6 or 7 in a row with Rand and Matt. And like you said, at least the first chapter next week, I checked, and I think the first two words are Master Gill. So we're sticking around.
Yeah.
It's just a lot of these two characters. And I think you're exactly right. To some degree, Robert Jordan is trying to illustrate this to us. He's saying, look how exhausted these characters are. You're probably tired about hearing about them also. But I think the beginning of this chapter also highlights how good of a job Robert Jordan is doing of getting us in these characters' heads, in that this chapter at the very beginning is the first time that we actually lay out the chronology of the previous 4 chapters, because those chapters, as we know, have been told in a series of like nested framing stories where it's never entirely apparent where we are in the story and how much time has passed in between. So the fact that even on my 5th read through, I could read that paragraph of like day 1 was lightning, day 2 was Pater, the scary dark friend, day 3 was the woman who tried to kill them in the barn, and be disoriented by that timing, I think that's really effective by Robert Jordan, right? He's able to write this book in a way where we feel as kind of outside of time as Rand and Matt, I'm sure, do, as exhausted as they are.
Yeah, and I think you could have convinced me that was 2 weeks, which is another way of saying what you're saying, is that it feels, I mean, part of that is our reading structure as well, that, it's been roughly 3 weeks with just these characters. So I think it did have me feeling that as well. And it was, in that regard, like a little surprising. It's like, oh, it's only been 3 days. And, I think there's a lot of worry about food and shelter, and so then you kind of skip over the fact it's only been like 3 nights in haystacks or whatever, which again would not be for me, but isn't the highest amount of suffering that we've seen in this book. So
yeah, and I just want to point out, this is a strategy that Robert Jordan uses pretty frequently. He is a big fan of yada yada yadaing 2 to 3 months, and then literally one of the books in this series takes place over 7 days. So there is a lot of tinkering around with when do we zoom in on and when do we kind of let the time pass quickly. And I think it's very interesting to me, and possibly to my mind, a slight misstep that Robert Jordan decided that a Rand solo adventure with Matt just being grumpy about his dagger was the place to really zoom in on and give us a day by day, moment by moment breakdown. It works at achieving the goal he's going for, but I'm not sure it's the most effective choice in terms of this book and just how much I enjoy it.
Yeah, and so the only other thing I'll say is staying with these characters does also, we should just note, ratchet up the tension on the others, because it's like we've really lost sight of them. And we'd spent a lot of time with Perrin and Egwene right before this. I mean, it's Nynaeve and Moraine that we haven't seen in a very, very long time. And so, not to jump to the next chapter, but as soon as they get to Caemlyn, I'm like, all right, like get looking around, like let's find them. Did they make it? Are they ahead of you? Are they behind you? I think that's all. That impatience I was feeling then is very deliberate, just to give Jordan credit for that again. Maybe then after that chapter you read, I did like the way it was presented, when they are hearing the other characters explain all the people coming after them and this kind of false narrative. I think that was effectively done, where it's like, oh, we know the truth of these things, and yet we see how easily it's been spun to kind of amp up that the story that they're dark fiends and that they're going to send more and more people after them because they're the troublemakers. And it was just kind of a little too easy to like make that narrative feel very true. So I liked that part.
Yeah, I really liked what almost felt like a little game of telephone, right? Where the Fade is giving orders to the innkeeper, and then the innkeeper is finding ways to transform whatever those orders are into something that a good person would feel okay with turning in these two individuals, right? And I think you're right. Just the ease with which it's like, I know what they look like, I know what they're carrying, let's claim something of it is stolen. Problem solved. It's effective. And I think that's the challenge, right? Is how much can you as a dark friend disguise the truth in what you're saying? And then as someone who isn't a dark friend, right, Rand and Matt, how would you ever know that if someone walked up to you and said this person stole a sword, that what they actually meant is we're going to murder the person who has that sword, right? I think it's a pretty effective kind of highlighting of just how screwed Rand and Matt are on their own, right? That's how easy it is to get them in trouble.
Yeah. So, I mean, what I don't want to set the agenda on this, but what I want next is I want you to unpack some of this history and refresh my memory and kind of straighten out what some of this history of Andor is, if there's nothing before that.
Yeah, so I have 2.5 paragraphs in my notes on this because I figured this might be a thing that I was going to be driving the discussion on. So first off, I just have to give Robert Jordan an enormous amount of credit as your dungeon master and as someone who DMs in a variety of circumstances. The hardest thing to do as a DM is to have a character give an exposition dump and have them still feel like a character and not an encyclopedia, right? I struggle with this a lot. If I have 3 lines of dialogue for one of my characters, I'm going to lose the accent in line 2, right? And I think Robert Jordan does a really good job in this section of keeping everything kind of in Bunt's stream of consciousness. It never becomes just him saying, here's what happened. You're always hearing it in his vernacular, in his phrasing, with his commentary. I think it's very well done. That being said, basically what Bunt says is, first off, things are going really bad. He mentions lambs being stillborn and ravens attacking animals and the dragon's fang being scrawled on the door, the same thing we've seen everywhere else. He then says that Bunt supports the queen. He thinks that she is a good ruler, but he does not believe the queen should continue to send her daughter and son to Tar Valon to train, right? And crucially in here, just names that are worth noting. We learn the Queen of Andor's name is Morgaze. We learn her daughter's name is Elaine, and we learn that her son's name is Gawain. In addition to that, he does just drop just randomly that the tradition of sending princes and princesses to Tar Valon is 3,000 years old. So when you're advocating for ending that tradition, that's a pretty big deal. And then he gives us what I refer to as last time in Andor. He basically says, like, and I know that this is a big tradition, but last time we sent people to Tar Valon, it didn't go well. And then he tells the story of the previous daughter heir of Andor, Tigraine, who disappeared, and her brother Luke, who died in the Blight. And it becomes apparent that after Tigraine disappeared, there was no one in line to ascend to the throne. And so that's when the queen died, Morgaze basically stepped forward, put forward a claim. And according to Bunt, her claim was only successful because the former queen's husband, Tarangale Damodred, then married Morgaze, the current queen. So basically we had the same king 2 leaders in a row, and it was his support that allowed Morgaze to kind of centralize support and become the queen. Bunt then gives some really kind of cryptic, but I think useful in the context of a couple of other things, context. He says, and I don't know why Morgaze decided to marry Tarangale. I don't know why Tarangale decided to bring Carrion into what was going on in Andor, but he said, you know what happened next. Carrion was brought into Andoran politics, the tree was chopped down, and the Aiel came over the mountains. So we don't know how or why Carrion is tied into this Aiel war, but we at least get some indication of the series of events that led to it, right? The daughter heir to Grain vanishes, the queen dies, Tarangale Damodred switches from one queen to another. Because of that, Carrion gets involved in Andor somehow, and then the cryptic part, a tree gets cut down and the Aiel show up. So we don't know the last chains of this or the last events of this chain, but we get a pretty good idea of some kind of recent past of Andor. And I think that's the Cliff's Notes, but tell me what your thought is on that or anything else you picked out. And then we can maybe think about where this fits in other things we've heard or kind of what it brings to mind for you.
Well, you're reminding me why I quit House of the Dragon, because it's like so similar to what that show has been so far, where it's a lot of competing claims and so on. We don't have to unpack those, but I think a lot of that passed me by. So when you get this kind of big exposition drop, it is tricky to, my mind goes immediately to building out generations, which you just did effectively. And then I think the kind of intermingling of them got a little confused in my mind. So you nicely straighten that out. The only other thing I'll grab onto is the tree getting chopped down. Reminds me again of Lord of the Rings, where you have the tree of Gondor that's on fire. And that's one of the visions that Pippin sees when he holds the Palantir stone. It's one of the visions that Sauron sends to kind of convince Gondor. Well, and he shares that with Gandalf, so that's why they go defend Minas Tirith. So I think again, when you see like the symbol of a city burning in that case, and this sounds like something similar, right? Like the trees are also obviously, symbolic of family lines and so on. So could it be the tree is chopped down, we're not going to have any further heirs or some such, but that in no way engages with the black-veiled Aiel. And this is the first time we've ever heard of the Aiel?
No, actually, no. Okay. Tam briefly talked about the Aiel when he was feverish. We later learned that we know it, that Tam fought in the Aiel War. That's where he got his sword. That's the conflict that he was involved in, apparently when he adopted or found Rand and brought him home. So this is kind of our connecting link, right? We know that Tam was at war and then came home, and we now know kind of the events roughly leading up to the moment of the war, and the piece of the past that we're now missing is exactly what caused that war, what was going on in the war, and obviously what happened to Tam during that conflict. But I kind of actually enjoyed this scene because it felt like we were kind of closing in to some degree on the central historical mystery of this story, what's going on with Rand. We kind of started that story at the beginning, finally, after grabbing bits of it at the end from Nynaeve and Tam and a few other people throughout the story.
And this would also presumably be the origin of the Heron sword.
Then. Yes. So at least during the wars when he purchased it, we know he just bought it from someone. But the why of it is interesting. So.
Yeah. Well, and then the only other resonance in what you said, the fact that they send the children away to the Aes Sedai and the warders, right?
Yeah.
That was really surprising to me. I mean, it resonates with, and I don't want to diminish their service at all, but when you see that like Prince William is in the RAF for a couple years, and I think Prince Harry actually saw combat time in Iraq, and again, I'm not diminishing that, but it's such a symbolic thing of like, no, the family that lives off the Commonwealth is going to give something back and serve and encourage other families to make similar sacrifices and so on. So it felt a little like that to me, but at the same time, the Aes Sedai and the warders are not just like the armed services. Like to me, these were competing power structures. So then it's more like, again, something out of Game of Thrones, where you give your children, you swap kids as like a
Yeah.
protection that you won't go to war or something like that.
Yeah, I think I read this as kind of the equivalent of if England had had some historical like relationship with Germany. And so every single British, future ruler was sent to a German university, right? It's like,
Yeah.
we're going to get you training outside of our area. And so it's kind of a combination of what you're describing, the
Yeah.
service, but external. And that's what makes it so odd, is it's not service to the Commonwealth that you rule over, it's service to something else. And so I think there's potentially more to unpack there. Also worth noting, we do learn in this chapter that the Queen of Andor does now and has historically had an Aes Sedai advisor. So the ties between Tar Valon and Andor seem to be pretty strong in a variety of different ways.
Yeah, and I guess the other piece that surprised me there is I had assumed that the Aes Sedai always required you to have some kind of talent, like Egwene showing an ability. And so it's like, okay, is there a bloodline of the rulers here that have that power, that are, adept at those skills? Or, are there other roles? You can kind of be an advisor or even like a chambermaid within the Aes Sedai or something like that, and that's just part of how you strengthen those relationships. I think those were some of the questions I had about that particular mechanic of this society.
And I will answer none of your questions because that's my role on this podcast.
Fair enough.
Unless you especially want to talk about Rand's dreams, I think that's pretty much all I had for chapter 34.
I mean, I just wrote down the refrain that Tom uses, Dream Tom, which is the dragon is one with the land, which was intriguing to me. The queen is wed to the land, but the dragon is one with the land.
Yeah.
And so the idea, again, that there's something deeper than the kind of structures of man just was what I took away from that. So yeah, I'm good with that if you want to go to Caemlyn.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think my only last note just on that dream, I pulled out exactly the same refrain that you did. And I think it's interesting. This is the first time that Rand has really had the dragon crop up much in his dreams, right? So far, it's all been pretty Baal Zaman and your destiny and I will own you or whatever. This is the first time something we've seen in kind of the far off real world has shown up. So interesting stuff. But yeah, let's dive into chapter 35, Caemlyn. So first off, Rand and Mat arrive in Caemlyn, and for the third or fourth time in this series, we get to see the country bumpkins go, oh my God, it's a city.
Buildings are so tall here. Yeah.
And actually, I was even going to, you mentioned Minas Tirith earlier. That's what the description of Caemlyn feels like to me. Just the classic, no adornments kind of, if you think of a fantasy city, this is the great fantasy city. Mat is clearly overwhelmed by what's going on and is obviously, being held down by whatever, force it is. We're assuming the dagger that's making him so downbeat. He's clearly struggling with the thought that they are going to get captured. There are a couple of moments in this chapter where Rand just has to be like, no, put up or shut up, keep walking. We need to not get caught. We do briefly learn that Bunt, the person who has been giving them the ride, knows that Rand and Mat are the people the innkeeper was talking about, and he gives them some advice to cover up the swords, stay out of trouble, make sure they're not pissing off what he thinks is a person, but is actually a fade. And then he more or less is like, okay, peace, and just completely vanishes within seconds. The boys then try to figure out exactly what they're going to do. We get our second Mat is a pessimist moment, but eventually they realize that they want to make their way towards the Queen's blessing. Along their way, a few things of interest happen. They try to get a few peddlers, try to rip them off by selling them artifacts that are supposedly Logains. They realize that everyone in the city who has a sword is covering it with either white cloth or red cloth. So Rand goes into a store and ends up buying the red cloth for his sword simply because it is the cheaper of the two options. And there also is clearly some sort of tension around people who support or don't support the Queen. They have a couple of different interactions where people ask them whether they're Queen's men or whether they're people who support the Queen. So something is clearly going on there. Once they arrive at the Queen's blessing, however, finally something seems to go well for Rand and Mat. The owner of the Queen's blessing, Basil Gill, seems to be a friend of Tom's. When they tell him that they know Tom, he immediately basically offers them a room for free and agrees to give them some assistance. And when he is told that Tom is dead, Gil basically just says, nah, I need to see the body.
Mm.
And so I kind of appreciate that from Robert Jordan. He's just like, yeah, not even the characters believe that guy's dead. And then finally, the end of this chapter is we get yet another exposition dump, but this one about Tom, a character who is not in the scene at all. We learn his backstory, his history with the Queen of Andor, and how his nephew's troubles caused some issues there, and he's not welcome in Andor. And in fact, the closing advice of the chapter is don't mention Tom in Caemlyn. So given that this kind of begins as the wide-eyed kids chapter and then ends up with the backstory of a character who we kind of presumed had died 6 or 7 chapters ago, I'm curious what your takeaway is on this, because it's kind of a bait and switch chapter to some degree, as far as I look at it.
Yeah, it's an interesting way to characterize it. I think it's funny to me because an opening like this chapter sounds great for a television show or a movie and is kind of boring to read. And that actually, no offense to my dungeon master who may or may not be on the line, but I always feel that way in a D&D campaign too, right? Like you enter a new town and there's like this weird awkward thing where the dungeon master can kind of be like, there's a big street, there's like these 5 places, like you've heard of these 3 things, and there's just always like the party is slow to react, to be like, I don't know, what do you want to do? Well, what should we do? What do you think he wants us to do? And so it kind of felt a lot like one of those moments where it's like, oh, they get here and the world is open at their fingertips, and yet they're like, what do you want to do? I don't know. So I think so that would be my reaction to kind of the first half. The second half, I liked Gil right away. I liked, like you said, that he was kind of just talking to them straight, and just his loyalty to Tom made him endearing. What I took away most of all is that he assumed that Tom's motivation would be to be protecting the boys from the Aes Sedai, which it was interesting to me that was where he went immediately. I think Tom did often express some kind of hesitation about Moraine, but I wouldn't have said that's how he felt in those moments, at least fully.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting about meeting Master Gil is that he gives us a very different side of Tom than we've seen before, right? Because mostly what we've seen is Tom, the greedy gleeman who wants to make as much money as possible, singing as many songs to as many people, right? And we have encountered Tom, the helpful uncle, who clearly we kind of were able to feel like maybe some of that, support for young men and wanting to make up for what happened to his nephew. Clearly that affected Tom and made him feel to some degree protective of Rand or Matt. But I think you're right to point out that I don't think there was ever really a point where Tom was like, I don't like Moraine, or we shouldn't trust her, or let's not do what the scary magic lady is saying, right? He was kind of along for the ride the entire time. And so I think the initial read that you get of Tom is that he's along for the ride either for selfish reasons or because he thinks he can benefit from the situation at some point in the future. Whereas what Gil is saying is actually all of that to some degree was a facade. He was there for Rand and Matt. And that's an interesting contrast from what we've seen. And it's not one that I think squares easily with the dozens upon dozens of examples we have seen of Tom kind of being chaotic neutral. That's kind of his go-to move, right? Is if it's good for me, I'll do it. That doesn't seem to be the portrayal that we're getting here, and that tension is a little bit interesting, right? It's odd to get a big character moment for a character who's not in the scene.
Yeah, I think the only previous bit of Tom that came to mind in that description was how often Tom made excuses to stick around. So in that portrait of him as we maybe perceived him before, which chaotic good, chaotic neutral, like he's going where the wind may blow. There was always that, well, I have every reason to go somewhere else, but I'm staying here. And I did think about that as I returned to that here, because I'm like, all right, was he really staying here to protect them now? Is this the correct read on Tom? And I'm compelled to say yes. And even though, again, maybe I'm too trusting of a character we just met.
Yeah, and I think this is something that puts some context on the last moment that we've seen Tom, right? Because the last time we saw him, he was charging an emerdrail saying, "Run away, get out of here." And you can very much interpret that moment, I think, as him diving in, sacrificing himself to save the boys. Or I think you can read that moment as like, Tom the crazy, cause a distraction and get out of there guy, right? And Master Gill is kind of pointing us in the direction of, no, Tom probably saw this as a sacrifice. He wanted to kind of get you out of there. We're kind of taking the chapter backwards, but I don't especially care. Tied up in this kind of character portrait of Tom, we also get a little bit of Tom's history. In particular, he has not always been a gleeman. He was once a court bard, and when he was a court bard, he was with the queen in seemingly pretty close quarters all of the time. So I'm curious whether this additional backstory of where Tom is coming from, as well as his potential motivations, did that surprise you? Or was there anything in there that you jumped out at like, oh, that tells me something I didn't expect about Tom?
That there was more to him did not surprise me, but that it was that did surprise me, right? That he would be, I guess it's a little classist of me, but he's of a higher scale of than other characters now, right? Because he was actually part of court intrigue, for lack of a better term. And so in light of everything we just learned last time, it's like, oh, okay, now we know that there's a complicating factor in this kind of hierarchy of the court and so on. So that's interesting. And then couple that with like, don't mention that guy. Don't mention that guy. Don't mention anything about him. This encouragement that, I want to help you all I can, and that means we all need to pretend we don't know Tom, like unless we're alone together, was very interesting. And I think most interesting in that is that, like, I just didn't expect him to be that big a player, right? Like he felt like a small scale. He's your friendly neighborhood gleeman, not an Avenger, and yet he seems to be an Avenger.
And I'd like to point out, this just solves a couple of like very tiny little mysteries that we haven't been able to resolve a few times. Every time that the boys are shocked by how big a city is, and Tom is like, that's not a real city. It's because he lived in Caemlyn most of his life, right? All of the times that he and Moraine seemingly were talking over everyone else's head, it's because he knows how to talk to an Aes Sedai. He's been a court bard for however long. I think this just gives a little bit of depth to a few moments that before it was like, oh, Tom is doing something interesting. And now it's like, oh, we understand he probably knows the intrigue around the court. He's used to interacting with royals and Aes Sedai and people in these high places. He kind of fits as a character a little better. A few of those pieces that felt odd shaped now are kind of smoothed over by this revelation in my mind.
Yeah, the fantasy connection I will make here, and this is not at all the best one, nor am I endorsing this person, but the way J.K. Rowling made sure that all the like sins of the parents came down into the kid generation, and so like as you kind of unveil each of the parents' backstory within and the relations they had, it always struck me how real each of those were. Because to a kid, right, Harry's dad was his hero. My dad wouldn't make fun of you, Snape, or whatever. And like, your dad did. He was kind of a dick, right? Like, and I love that as a thing authors do, which is to remind us that nobody is simple. And so I think this is absolutely that, where it's like, you might have just kind of written him off as a bard or a jester or whatever, but no, he's actually a pretty sophisticated guy. And I like how you're pointing out, like, there are these little pieces that you might have missed along the way that suggested that.
I will also just say Tom feels like the kind of character that I have seen 100 times in Dungeons and Dragons, where someone shows up to the game on the first day with like a 20-page backstory and is like, I have done everything. And then the DM looks at it and is like, you're level 1. So your character is 70 and that's why they're slow. And I agree with you. I think this is something that authors can do really effectively when they find a way to tell the story of one time that is also a reflection of a previous story. And I think what Robert Jordan has kind of shown hints of but not yet fully revealed is that he's got like a whole house of mirrors, right? He has many different time periods that you can see reflected in the present because of this whole circular time thing that he's doing. And this is yet another layer of, I think, what he's been building. We've got the 3,000-year-old layer, and we've got the 2,000-year-old layer, and we've got the like 20 years ago when Tom was horny layer. Like there's lots of layers to this onion.
And it just gives a richer experience. I think you're, and you know, I honestly don't have anything much to say about the first part of the chapter, but I will say, like, I am appreciating your reading of this as like a great bait and switch. And you know, obviously Master Gill's suggestion just, and all this information just confirms like Tom's coming back. Like, you know, we wouldn't spend the time learning about this guy if that was the entirety of his contribution. So I do appreciate that we're not kind of playing games around that point. But it also, you know, the thematic link between the two is just a reminder, like the boys and us don't know all that much yet. Like, you know, we're closing in on page 600. We've been on a lot of this journey, but this is just a much bigger picture than we were maybe expecting. I'm thinking of on I'm sure everybody, all D&D groups had the roll 20 experience over pandemic, if not prior. And you know, there's the version of the map where you just get the little piece that like is in your direct line of sight for 20 and everything else stays dark. And it's like, yeah, you have the map at the front of the book, but you really aren't experiencing much of this at all yet. And we're just going to keep peeling it back, as to steal your phrase for it.
Yeah, and I think a really good example of this, to get us at least talking a little bit about the early part of the chapter, is when we arrive in Caemlyn and we see just a bunch of customs that we are not sure if they are new or old or what they mean. Right? We show up and there are these white and red wraps on swords. We have no idea, neither do Rand and Matt. We get mentions of like supporting or not supporting the queen, or supporting or not supporting Aes Sedai. Even like Bunt, the like farmer who won't shut up, seems to have a fairly nuanced position on Aes Sedai and royalty and all of these sorts of things. And then we've also just got whatever is going on with the false dragon, which we understand as there was a guy who did a thing and was captured by some people, and yet it's enough to bring tens of thousands of people into the city to see this man. And so just with so much swirling around in the city, I think this is something Robert Jordan has done before in Baerlon and in a few other places, where he kind of says, here are the 20 potential conflicts, let's see which ones blow up. I think what's a little different here is we're now far enough out of our character's comfort zone that we don't even know which of the things we're seeing are just normal stuff and which are the conflicts that are going to blow up. And that's really interesting to me as a reader, and hopefully for you as a first-time reader.
Yeah, I really don't want to say powder keg again, but it, again, I think the pervasive feeling is this whole world is on edge. And you know, as we continue, I'm waiting for it all to explode. And you know, clearly that these guys are often the fuse. Our characters are often the fuse that just lights up all these different cities and all these different events. So, you know, I think I just, as a reader, I tune out a little bit more towards like the cultural things, like those I don't often find compelling. To my detriment. I'm not saying that's the way to approach anything like that. But I am more interested in the like, okay, what might have changed very recently, what maybe hasn't changed, you know, or is an old custom these boys just aren't that familiar with. So that is probably the more intriguing side to me. And I think a lot of the stuff with the false dragon, I just kind of write off because it doesn't seem like the real show. So waiting for, you know, oh well, yeah, we know who's really behind all this, and this is just a distraction. So even if the character, I guess that's dramatic irony at its finest, right? All the at least the non-named townspeople are falling for this, and we're just like, nope, this isn't what you should be worried about right now. Especially this kind of celebratory affair that like, oh, it's over now, we beat this. It's like, no. So yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I think one thing that jumped out to me is in all of this lack of normalcy, in the city being flooded by, I keep wanting to call them refugees, even though they're really not, right? They're just people who are coming to the city to
Looky
see the
loos.
dragon. Yeah, looky loos. That's what we're going to go with. So the city is just flooded with looky loos, and there are looky loos just left and right. Crazy things happening. And then just the most normal thing in the world happens, which is a bunch of people decide they're going to make money off it. Right. And just
Yeah.
the scene of, I think the way Rand describes it is he has been, people have tried to sell him pieces of Loghain's like cloak that would be enough to make 12 cloaks. And that just to me rings very true of how big cities work, right? No matter how crazy or absurd the world gets, right? You're going to be at the parade for the Celtics winning the title, and there's going to be 20,000 people, and there's still going to be spare change guy in the common doing exactly the same thing he's always been doing.
Yeah.
That's just how I felt in that moment. I was like, yeah, that's how cities work.
My example of that is there's a guy who's in Harvard Square all the time. And I mean, I don't go there much anymore. He always sees me coming and he goes, "Sir, you master gentleman." Like he's very proper with me as he asks for my change. And I watched Good Will Hunting recently, and damn it, if he wasn't in the background of one of the scenes of Matt Damon and Ben Affleck, I'm like, how long has he been panhandling in Harvard Square? And I mean, I recognized him right away. I'm like, oh, he's there all the time, and he was in his spot. So it's like, all right, yeah. But you're right. I mean, that was just a tangent for no good reason. But yes, that there's always the guy with the fake Oakleys ready to sell them for $10 or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, what is the point of having a podcast if you can't go on a tangent for no reason and make people listen to it?
Yeah.
Honestly, this chapter Caemlyn, I kind of saw as the Tom backstory chapter, and not much else is really going on here from my notes. Was there anything else in here that jumped out at you or that you wanted to make sure we talked about?
Only the sense that I already said that I have nothing else in my notes, but like, I'm like, guys, like you did what you were supposed to do. You followed Tom's instructions, which I think was the right call. But also, like, get looking around. Like, who else has made it? I want to see who's here. I was, trying to make guesses off of the next chapter icon and things like that, which we can save for next time. But my anticipation of getting, I don't even know if I need a reunion. I just need an update on the other characters. That's what's overwhelming my reaction to these two chapters in particular.
Yeah, and I think we mentioned this last time. I see this as the last kind of long bit of uphill before we get to the really fun part of this roller coaster. I was counting down. I think we've got 9 more weeks left on the podcast. And of those, like 6 or 7 are really solid chapters. Let's just get through the last of this Rand and Matt being whiny section, and things will turn around a little bit.
That's 9 more weeks of season 1 of the podcast.
That is correct.
Let's just clarify. We're not gonna quit. Our intention is to keep going and to keep on this adventure. I know our loyal listener Ben sends me messages because he binged the audiobook before we started, so he's anxiously awaiting book 2 so he can read along with us because he says it's better that way, he thinks. So yeah, well, I mean, I think that's a good segue to say we hope you are all continuing to enjoy reading along with us or listening to us discuss the readings in order, if you will. And, I'm determined to get through this by the end of this year, 2022, as we record. It took me way too long to remember what year it was. And so we're anticipating a few more weeks, kind of steady on. We were talking before we started recording that the next week is 2 chapters, brings us a little short, which I think is welcome from time to time. So next time you hear us, we'll be discussing chapter 36, Web of the Pattern, and chapter 37, The Long Chase. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct.
All right.
And both of those chapters, I think, are going to get us a little bit more interesting character moments, but also push the plot forward, which I know is a thing we've been waiting for a little bit in the last few chapters. And I think the last thing I kind of want to leave us with before we head out is that we are now getting to the point where we are, 2/3, 3/4 of the way through this book. And so as we're kind of arriving, one of the interesting things from my perspective in this book is that we are this close to the end, And I have no idea what the climax of this book looks like at this point, right? We're not building towards some specific big moment. And so as we move forward, I think it's really worth keeping an eye on what is the overarching kind of plot or arc of this book and where is it going towards, because chapter 36, the web of the pattern, and chapter 37, the long chase, I like to sum things up twice, are going to get us a little bit closer to seeing kind of what the long game is in this book, because it's a long book in a long series. So hopefully you'll join us next time as we get a chance to dig into some of these mysteries and also get a chance to go just a bit deeper through the glass columns.
So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend the show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.